Hey, everybody. Welcome to Saturday morning class here in Foundations of Language and Literacy Development. Sorry, this is a little late, but I wanted to make sure that this was right and just get some basic overview stuff, particularly around the component views of reading, because I think the situated views of reading are a little more self-explanatory as the authors write them. So I'm going to give you a little overview here. I hope it won't be too long. I'm going to share my screen and just get going. So we'll start. Here we are, class 5. This is our first perspectives on reading development. Again, remember, next week is Indigenous Peoples Day, no class, so we won't see each other again until the following Monday. So orientation to the unit. General theories of reading, reading and writing systems and what those mean for reading development. That's the second one. And then moving beyond models of reading to thinking much more about situated contexts and different ways of reading, different ways of thinking about reading. So right now we're in the general theories. But first things first, reading versus reading comprehension. Is there a difference? Age of the reader matters. So in studies of early readers, sometimes researchers just think about word reading development, the development of just being able to read the words, and they'll refer to that as reading. So if you're ever reading studies of early reading acquisition and development, take a look at how they operationalize reading. Do they mean kids' ability to read the words, or do they mean kids' abilities to comprehend the text? Those are very different things. However, they're related, as we'll see. Just like language from a developmental perspective, developmental reading perspectives parse reading into its component parts. So you'll remember, we talked about in the language unit, some people think about language as these discrete component parts, morphology, syntax, vocabulary, etc. Those develop differently over time. And then we also think about it as holistic and language used in context. Same thing with reading, same idea, not surprising, because reading, a big part of reading is language. And the folks who do that in today's readings are Aaron et al. And the Lee et al. You get to choose one of those, or you can read them both. They're both dealing with the same component theory of reading. Just like language, component theories of reading are useful, but insufficient, in my opinion. Maybe not in yours. We'll see what you think. But the other two readings argue that reading isn't just componential. It occurs in these situated contexts. So thinking about that. But the foundation of these component models that you'll be reading, and particularly with the Lee and the Aaron et al. Ones, the cognitive part of their component model, is this simple view of reading. It's important to know about this theory because if you think about, if you look at policy debates on reading and reading instruction right now, they are driven in part by this little, what would you call it, equation of reading. It's not even really a theory. It's an empirical model of reading, which is called the simple view of reading. And it is this: RC equals D times LC. Or reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. And part of this equation is clever, because if your decoding equals 0, that means your reading comprehension will equal 0 no matter how good your language is, right? If you can't read the words on the page, you can't read for comprehension. Similarly, if your linguistic comprehension is 0, then your reading comprehension will be 0. So linguistic comprehension is your ability to speak and comprehend spoken language. So if you don't speak Spanish, but you read in English, I could very quickly teach you to read the words in Spanish, because Spanish decoding is very related to English decoding. So you could read any Spanish text, but you wouldn't comprehend it because you don't speak Spanish. So in that case, your decoding skill could be close to perfect, like 1-1. But your linguistic comprehension is 0. So no matter how good your decoding is, if you don't understand the language, your reading comprehension will also be 0. So it's clever in that respect, right? That makes intuitive sense. But it's also a developmental component model. That is, the interaction is literally statistical. So for those of you who've taken statistics, a statistical interaction is when you take two variables and you multiply them together to create a new variable that helps understand the relationship between the two. So D times LC, D would be one variable, LC would be another variable. You'd multiply them together to get what's called a cross product variable. So that's a third variable. Sorry about the spelling error, decoding without understanding the development of linguistic comprehension. But this is the simple view in developmental perspective. So this idea of language comprehension over time, as kids develop as readers, their language comprehension becomes increasingly strategic. So you start using things like context clues to figure out unknown vocabulary words. You know what I mean? Things like that. You start drawing on your linguistic knowledge to make increasing sense of text. Whereas with word recognition, decoding, that should become increasingly automatic over time. You shouldn't be devoting much cognitive energy to reading the words themselves, because those processes become automatic. And so as you get older and they become automatic, you can focus more on the language comprehension, not on the decoding. And so Catherine Snow and Young Kim wrote this paper on problem spaces and literacy around the simple view. So they argued that this word reading and spelling, sounds and letters, these are relatively small problem spaces in literacy. And I'll show you why in a minute. Whereas things like vocabulary, language development broadly, understanding argument structures and broad meaning-making approaches, those are larger problem spaces from an instructional perspective, relatively easy and constrained to teach code-based in the code space, that is, just decoding, much more open and subject to variation in these larger spaces that deal with language and meaning making. So here's what they mean by that. So this is so in English, I'm talking about English here, and English alphabetic decoding. The development of word reading looks something like this. Here's my little graph. Boom. So age on the bottom, mastery, you see it goes to 110, but really it just levels off at 100. What you see is as kids get older, when kids are born, birth, age 1, age 2, age 3, age 4, there's no decoding skills because kids aren't decoding. But when formal reading instruction begins, at least in the US context, this may vary in other places, around age 5.5 or 6, then you see this huge jump in word reading mastery. And barring atypical development, what you see is by like age 9 or 10, it levels off because there's no new learning that needs to happen. In English, there are around 44 sounds in the alphabet, and there's 26 letters that represent those sounds. It's a finite, small problem space. So what you do is, this is one of my favorite words, kids often hit asymptote. That is the upper limit on learning. There's nothing more to learn. You've cracked the code. And again, this doesn't happen with everybody. Lots of kids struggle with the code, dyslexia being foremost among them, sort of a core phonological processing disability. But one thing to note just from the multilingual perspective is bilingual kids, English learners, show similar developmental trajectories, and decoding doesn't emerge as a big challenge for English learners as compared with monolingual peers. By contrast, language development is a much larger problem space. So here's what this, I just made this up, but something like this. Here, language starts developing from birth because presumably in lots of instances, kids are being talked to by their caregivers and their providers and their parents and siblings and extended family, everything, right? Linguistic inputs, like we talked about, make language go. The difference between decoding and language, as you can see here, is there's no asymptote, right? No one has learned all the words in any language. If we talked about linguistic features as a languaging perspective, you're always accumulating new linguistic features, things like that. So there's no stopping the development. So you go beyond 100 here because this is sort of a metric of just increasing linguistic proficiency. You track back to the multilingual questions. Language does emerge as a key differentiator in literacy outcomes for linguistically diverse kids, because the language of the text is often static, and the language that the kids bring is often quite heterogeneous, and sometimes those mismatches result in text comprehension difficulties. So language components, they do predict. So this is research that I have done over time with my colleague, Rebecca Silverman. We called our project Claves. Back then, it meant comprehension, linguistic awareness, and vocabulary in English and in Spanish when we were doing these kind of component models. And what we found was, if you think about metalinguistic awareness as measured variables, morphological awareness, semantic awareness, and syntactic awareness, and word knowledge like vocabulary, which is not particularly metalinguistic, but it is linguistic, all of those predict reading comprehension independently, taking decoding into account. So from a component perspective, there is some validity to the model, to the fact that you need decoding in the simple view. You can't read without it, so decoding can't be zero, but you also need language. And that is true. It's just true, but wholly insufficient. Last thing on this, over time, this is the developmental part of the simple view that's very important to take away. Over time, there's a reversal of the predictive strength of decoding versus language in the reading process. So for little kids, early reading component studies will show kids ages 5 through 8, if you're looking at how much variance is explained in an outcome, like in a reading comprehension outcome, you'll find that decoding explains a whole lot more variation in reading comprehension outcomes than language does with the little kids. And that's because they're devoting so much cognitive energy to sounding out the words that the texts are relatively simple. So they're focusing really hard on sounding out the words, and the language of the text is simple. So decoding is much more important in the reading comprehension process for the little kids. That doesn't mean language is unimportant. It just means it doesn't play as big a role in text comprehension for young kids. By contrast, as kids get older, the language of the texts that they're reading become more complex, more in-depth, more information. Decoding is presumed to become more automatic. As a result, if you're looking at explained variance in a reading comprehension outcome for older kids, you will always see language as a much more salient predictor of reading than decoding will be, which makes sense if you think back on those developmental models, because if decoding is hitting asymptote, it's not going to be as predictive because there's less variation in it to begin with. We can unpack that more when we meet in person. If you have questions, send me an email about that if you want to learn more about explained variation. The most variation you can explain in any outcome in a statistical model is 100%. So here you might see language comprehension predicting, 50% of the variation in reading comp, and decoding only explaining like 10%, whereas the reverse might be true for the little kids. And one thing of note in the Lee et al. And the Aaron et al. Studies, they talk about latent variables. This is a statistical thing. A latent variable is a statistical construct where you try and get this idea of a broad construct as indicated by a series of observed variables. So in this Lee et al., they've got these 4 different constructs. And so what they did was they worked with kids and they gave them all of these observed measures of the construct. So accuracy, fluency, vocabulary, and linguistic comprehension, you can see right there, that is the simple view of reading. And that is what they're calling a cognitive factor. So all these variables load on to a new variable that they're calling cognitive. And then they've got motivation and acculturation making up a variable they call psychological. And ecological is made up of number of L1 and L2 books in the home, levels of maternal education, age of reading. That's ecological. That's hardly ecological, but they're constrained by observed variables in sort of articulating their components. And then reading comprehension is measured by a time 1 and a time 2 measure of reading. Again, questions on statistics, you can email me, set up a time to talk about them, or we can pick it up again when we meet in person next time. But you'll see the RAND Reading Study Group says, yeah, okay, we're going to move beyond that. And they're talking about the reader. This is actually not totally different from the componential view. But the reader is reading, all of that cognitive stuff from the simple view is going on with the reader, but it's happening in a much more dynamic circumstance. That is, they're reading a certain text, right? That text is going to vary by genre, difficulty level, even font type, which, you know, is something to think about. Also, the activity. Why are you reading in the first place? Are you reading to learn? Are you reading for facts? Are you pleasure reading? Are you reading to get the gist only? The reasons for reading have a lot to do with how well or that you comprehend the text that you're coming to. And then importantly, all of that is occurring in a broader sociocultural context, right? So this could be a multilingual classroom where, you know, all the kids speak different languages. This could be a monolingual classroom where all the kids are coming from sort of one sort of language background. Any number of different contexts affect the way that this model works. And that's really important. And those componential models do not take that into account in any meaningful way. They can't, because they're constrained by the methodological orientation of psychological developmentalism, right? So they're constrained by the domain of study. And that's what people like Jim G have the biggest problem with when it comes to these component models of reading, is they don't take situated context into account, right? So the other thing we're reading is that Charles Perfetti article, which is a much more complex model of reading, but it centers word reading. Whereas in the G, language reading is situated language, he's centering language in reading. So you've got these two very sort of divergent perspectives in a lot of ways. And so the question for you to think about with those two readings is, can these two views be reconciled in any meaningful way? Do they make sense together at all? And finally, so where do you land in your own thinking about your own reading? If you read in multiple languages, is it different when you read in English as opposed to reading in Korean, if you speak and read those two languages? For me, I read Spanish and English. When I read in Spanish, I read way slower. That's one thing that's different. When I read in Spanish, I have to engage my reading strategies much more sort of in more depth. So for example, rereading is a good reading strategy. I do a lot of rereading when I read in Spanish. Or when I rewrite a lot when I write in Spanish, much more than I do in English. So I approach literacy, reading and writing, broadly speaking, in English very differently than I do in Spanish, but I'm pulling on my English strategic abilities to apply them to Spanish. So what do you do if you're a multilingual reader? If you're a monolingual reader, that's fine. What do you do? Is it just natural? Is there anything you do when you come across things you don't understand beyond rereading? So how do they apply? Which of these models speaks to you more in terms of thinking about this stuff? And then finally, the activity, thinking about the different models of reading proposed in the materials, try to conceptualize them in terms of their similarities, differences, degrees of personal resonance. And so here are the 4 questions that I sort of want you to address. If you want, in writing this, you can just write something free form that addresses these. You don't have to identify that you're answering each of these individually, or you could make each of these a different header and answer them discretely. However you want to do it is fine. but it's up to you. Okay. That's the end of that. So that's all I wanted to do, was give you this brief overview. I am going to stop now. Wish you luck. Have a good time. Have a good rest of your weekend. Look forward to reading your stuff after Monday. I will be providing feedback within the next few days of your uploads. So thanks very much, and I will see you soon. Bye.